Thank you, Megan, and welcome. This is really marvelous to see such a turnout and for this particular topic. I mean, maybe 20 years ago, this many people in Berkeley would come out for the subject of mindfulness, but nowhere else on the planet. And really, if you look around, I feel very impressed that so many people have come out to support Mindful Schools, which is doing just extraordinary work out there in Oakland and in many other school systems around the Bay Area. So thank you for coming. Your support is absolutely essential. And it goes way beyond just the monetary support or even the volunteer support. What the biggest, most important way in which we can be supportive of this is to really understand it in a deep way and to live our way into it ourselves. And so I'm really, really honored to be here and just, explore what the virtues of mindfulness might be in K through 12 education. I won't be talking about higher education, but there's a huge movement to bring mindfulness and the various contemplative practices into higher education as well. And I decided not to really script this whole thing because, mindfulness is really all about being in the present moment. And so if I had planned what I'm going to say to you before seeing you, it's just a little bit antithetical to the whole purpose of it. So it's like, walking on a tightrope without a net. And, I do it all the time, but I can never attest to how it's going to turn out. But I'm very touched that you're here. And the general idea is to just take your money, and so now you can go home if you don't like it. The other thing is that here we are in the Bay Area, and I'm not from around here, but I do now have 2 children in this area and 1 grandchild, and so I have family here, and I also feel like as I look around the audience, even if my family wasn't here, I have family here. Because I see a lot of people who I know and who I go way back with, and with a real heart connection, and I feel that that's only I'm sensing that that's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what goes on in this community around the Bay, the general Bay Area. There's something very, very special here, and I really want to acknowledge it and bow to it, and just you may not all know each other, but the feeling tone of just walking into this room is really rather extraordinary, and I feel like this is the way the world is going to change. Mindfulness is really all about living our lives as if they really mattered. It's not a technique, it's not a gimmick, it's not a strategy, it's not a methodology. It has techniques, it has methodologies of various kinds, but the essential part of it has to do with how we live our lives, and Megan was very articulate, I think, in pointing out that it has something to do with what you might call interiority. And very often we're so busy out there that and doing, that we forget who's doing all the doing. Now, how many of you are actually teachers? Raise your hands if you're, wow, that's maybe half the audience. And I include school administrators and principals and all of that. So let's see the show of hand again. Wonderful. And I'm talking about in the schools, not in the university, thank you. That's probably the other half. Wonderful. Well, it's really very moving to be here tonight and to explore what the possibilities are. I really want to honor the profession of teachers. You guys are on the front lines, in the trenches every day under huge amounts of stress. It's an intrinsically stressful profession for which there's never enough support. And I hope that in some sense tonight ignites a certain passion for you that you already are totally familiar with. That's why you went into teaching in the first place. I mean, this is like, a beautiful undertaking. Now, not all of us are teachers, but all of us went to school, I'll bet. Maybe there are a few people who homeschooled. How many people, I won't put you on the spot, but how many people actually went to elementary school? Raise your hands. Even if you didn't graduate, So we have an experience of this. I mean, we know. We have been educated to one degree or another, and we've kind of made it this far. But, so we might reflect for a moment, what is it that we most took away from our education, and whether there's ever an end to education, for that matter. And for me, as a product of the New York public schools, I don't know about you, but I can remember all the names of my teachers. I can remember, is that better? I can remember the names of all, did you hear anything I said before this? I can remember the names of all of my teachers except for the 5th grade. I don't know what happened in the 5th grade. How many of you can remember the names of at least one teacher in elementary school who changed your life, who touched you in some way or other, and she or he may never know about it, but if you reflect on it, there was some moment in some class and you were touched. And I certainly remember what it was like to be at PS 173 in Manhattan, and I'm happy I went there. I learned a lot. I think we're in a very different world now, and teachers are being asked to do things that before, were taken care of elsewhere, very often in the family. And so, kids are often coming to school, say, without breakfast, or with all sorts of disorganization going on in the family, or sometimes even violence. So teachers are being asked to do more and more to try to sort of teach a curriculum, and especially with all this emphasis on testing, without any kind of backup or specific training for dealing with these kinds of things. And I like to think that, for any learning, maybe you've experienced this yourself, before you actually do the work, let's take the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra, okay? Is there such a thing? Is it called the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra? Okay. Is that what Barbara's in? Okay. So, before they play, even these great musicians with great instruments and with great music, what do they do first? They take time. They take a lot of time to actually tune their instruments. And I think the metaphor works for schools as well. I mean, if you have kids coming in all sorts of states of, chaos or disorganization, wouldn't it be just commonsensical to maybe take a few minutes and tune the instrument of learning before you actually engage in the learning? I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense. So how would you do that? I remember a lot at 173, and then even worse in junior high school, which was like a wild place. Even back in the 50s, it was a very wild place, and it was dangerous to go to the bathroom and things like that. I remember very clearly a lot of teachers shouting at the class to pay attention. Anybody have an experience like that? Anybody ever find, not you teachers, of course, you wouldn't do that, but, just shouting at the class to pay attention. But you see, attention is a skill. I mean, without training in attention, most kids aren't going to know what you mean, pay attention. And I felt, because I did know what it meant, but I felt like when I was little, I was paying attention. I was just paying attention to something more interesting than the teacher. And sometimes, maybe you've had this experience also, sometimes I could make the teacher get very big in my field of vision just by staring at her. She'd just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then sometimes I could actually make her get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that was interesting. And what was going on out the window was interesting. And what kids were doing under the desks, even before, texting, was interesting. So part of the challenges here, of course, is how do we make school interesting? I'm not going to actually talk about that tonight, but I do think that it's really important to remember that any subject can be made interesting or deadly boring. And that involves the passion of the teacher. Okay? The love, really it's love radiating out, love of the subject matter, of the topography of the subject, of the possibility for actually illuminating something that's important, a moment of, I get it, and actually to decode letters or to learn how to read a word. I mean, I remember to this day, I remember that it was really hard for me to get the word SAID. It just didn't make sense to me. And there were words like that, that now we got it, but there was a kind of learning curve. And kids have different learning styles. And so how much can we actually create an environment where kids will really be met and seen and known for who they are, so that when it comes to this passion or encountering the possibility of true learning, that it is a collective endeavor where the teacher is in this domain of connectivity with the children, and the children are paying attention because it's the most interesting thing around. Okay? So now, do they still take attendance in class? Do you take attendance? Yes. Back in the old days, they used to take attendance. And when they took attendance, it was like they called your name, and then you said, present. Yeah, here. Or that's me, all right, but usually you said present. Usually you said present. But a lot of time it wasn't the case. Yes, the body was sitting at the desk, but so it's non-trivial to sort of tune in to your students in such a way that you actually have something worthy of attention to give. And that doesn't really have that much to do with the subject matter. It has to do with your love. At least that's my experience. And so we owe the kids our love. But if we're stressed and exhausted and burned out, what's the first thing to go? That very love. So if we're not, in some sense, taking care of ourselves and tuning our own instruments, and we're doing this year after year after year, or day after day after day, under, very stressful conditions, that's almost the prescription for things not being optimal. Let's put it that way. And so part of the message here about mindfulness in education is that the teachers could benefit enormously. Never mind the students for a moment. I think that teachers and all human beings, I mean, that's my hidden agenda, is like, I don't actually make that many distinctions. I mean, if you're breathing, I think this is actually useful. We do not have a great track record with the dead, however, I'll tell you that. But as long as you're breathing, from our perspective, and we say this in the mindfulness-based stress reduction, as long as you're breathing, no matter what, and we work with people with all sorts of chronic illnesses, our perspective is, and we say this to people, as long as you're breathing, there's more right with you than wrong with you, no matter what's wrong with you. Okay? And that itself is like, oh, no one's ever said that to me before. That's a kind of orthogonal way of looking at things. Maybe I could pour energy into what's right with me, let the rest of the medical center take care of what's quote-unquote wrong, and see what the outcome is. But then I'm participating in my own health and well-being. Okay. Now that doesn't have to only be in the hospital for people with chronic illness. I mean, the practices that we teach in mindfulness-based stress reduction are virtually universal and valuable for anybody, no matter what they're doing, if they care about it. If they don't care, there's nothing, I mean, that's fine. You have to be ready in some sense to tune into this, because mindfulness is not a thing, and it's not a gimmick, as I was saying. So I might as well say what it is, but before I say what it is, I think I'll back up a little and just, maybe we should practice a bit together. Would you be up for that? Because it's Berkeley, it's like... I'm not sure I'd even dare this anywhere else, this early in the talk. I mean, by the end of the talk, we loop everybody in, but, this early in the talk, I don't know. But it is Friday night, is it? Is it not? Yeah, Friday night. And it's the end of what used to be called a long week, a long work week. Now there's no end to the work week, so even when you're off, you're not off. It's the end of Friday, the end of the weekday. So maybe we should take a few moments to just kind of drop in, okay? And what I thought is that we'll actually, now, how many of you actually practice meditation in one way or another? Practice it in your lives. Oh, it's Berkeley again. It's like a majority of people. So I can't even surprise you. Is there anybody here who's just walked in off the street thinking this was something? Never ever heard guided instructions for meditation? Nobody. Yeah.
Everybody sat straight when you said that.
Yeah, I noticed. Okay, so that was my point. We're not going to sit up straight. We're going to actually stand. Okay. See, because maybe you have in your mind someplace, locked in there, someplace in the brain that, oh, meditation, I know what that is, and then it's like the Buddha in some museum. But no, let's just stand for a moment, because... And how many of you are here from San Francisco? Okay, so you can't drive home tonight. Maybe you were smart enough to take the BART, but the alternative is the long way round mindfully. Okay? You'll love it. You'll love it. So thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. So let's actually just bring awareness. Megan mentioned self-awareness, and everybody laughed. So let's actually bring some awareness to the fact that we're standing. And if you can't stand, that's fine. Then you do it in a chair. And if you can't do it in a chair, you can lie down on the floor. Here it's not the most convenient, but the point is it's independent of posture. But simply standing. And maybe feeling, even through your shoes, the connection with the floor. And the sensations in the body as it elevates itself in the gravitational field. Sensations in the feet and the legs. And the pelvis. And the whole of the torso held up by the spine that's elevating itself vertebra by vertebra, and with the rib cage and the thoracic spine, and just a sense of the breath moving in the body as you bring awareness also to the appendages we call arms hanging off the rib cage, mostly from the shoulder blades, and only anchored in one spot, the medial clavicles, the collarbones. And then the neck elevating right out of the torso and the head. A sense of a human being standing completely here. Completely, or as best you can manage, awake and in touch with the sensory field of the body, moment by moment. You don't have to feel anything in particular, but you can feel what's here to be felt, which might include numbness or nothing. Everything would be fine. And just standing, breathing, and resting in the knowing of standing and breathing. And that knowing we often refer to as awareness. It's not a conceptual knowing. It's much bigger than that. And seeing if you can simply rest here moment by moment. In the only moment we're ever alive, the only moment we're ever alive. This one. And while we're standing, and we could stand in silence for the next hour, that would be good. But we won't. But while you are standing, I'm going to actually recite a poem. And I'd like to invite you to stay in the experience of standing and just let the poem wash over you, wash through you, whatever it does. Or if you don't want to listen, don't listen. And the poem is by a fellow named David Wagoner. And it's about the Native American culture in the Pacific Northwest. And it's the response of the elder when children come to the elder and say, "What do I do when I'm lost in the forest?" And in the old-growth forest of the Pacific Northwest, you didn't have to go in more than a few yards and turn around 3 times, and direction might be completely gone. So it's not a theoretical or an abstract question. What do I do when I'm lost in the forest? And here's the elder's response. Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are, wherever you go, you must say, "Here, I have made this place around you. If you leave, you may come back again." Saying, "Here, no 2 trees are the same to raven. No 2 branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, then you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you." Life knows where you are. You must let it find you. So I botched the first stanza of that a little bit, but no worries. It's been a long time since I've called on that poem. Now let's actually see if we can bring awareness to the air around the body as we stand here. And a sense of the body's in our vicinity, around us, in front of us, beside us. And then let's begin to introduce a little bit of, well, let's become aware rather than introducing anything. Let's become aware of the movement in the body. Because there are tiny movements happening even now to allow us to maintain our balance like this. So maybe just bring some awareness to the micro movements that are associated with standing in the gravitational field. Can you feel them? And now let's start exaggerating them a little bit. Just letting the body move. And maybe taking one hand and seeing if you can move it through the air, as if you were underwater, so that you could feel the air streaming like water. And at any pace you like, but it could be really slow. And because you've got people on either side, it doesn't have to go out to the ends of the earth. But to just play with the air and the feeling of the fluidity of the body meeting the fluid of the air, and just in whatever way you care to, bringing awareness to the body in motion and how that works with the breath. And then just letting yourself undulate as if you were a long strand of kelp being waved in the ocean. You might imagine that little kids would like to be kelp. And really being aware of when the breath moves in and when the breath moves out. And noticing if there are any thoughts that get generated by this. Seeing if as best you can stay in the actual experiencing of the moving. Doesn't have to be any particular anything, and there's no need to be self-conscious because nobody's looking at you. But feeling it on the inside. And then when you're ready, slowly letting yourself come back to stillness. Relative stillness. Just standing. Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. Must ask permission to know it and be known. Listen, the forest breathes. It whispers, I have made this place around you. If you leave, you may come back again. Saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, then you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. If you notice the mind drifting at any point, just bring it back to standing, sense of the body as a whole, standing and breathing. If you notice the mind drifting at any point, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yeah, you just notice that your mind is drifting, and as best you can, bringing it back to the body and the breath. Body as a whole, standing here, breathing. Thank you. Sing out anytime you can't hear me. I'm glad you're right in front of the speaker, though. I'll try to behave. So when you're ready, let's actually, with awareness, so that we know how we get there, take our seat with full awareness. And let me invite you to sit in a posture that embodies dignity, whatever that means for you. And seeing if you can just bring awareness to the body, sitting and breathing. The breath is still moving in and out of the body. There's still an entire universe of sensations. It's somewhat different from standing, but nevertheless, universe of sensations. Can we simply rest in the awarenessing of sitting here, being fully attentive, fully awake to this moment as it is. If thoughts are moving through the mind, fine. If there's some kind of emotional tone or mood that you're experiencing, also fine. Simply being aware of it. Doesn't matter what it is. Doesn't matter what the thoughts are. The knowing faculty we call awareness just holds it all like clouds moving through the sky. And we can actually be the sky rather than be caught up in the clouds. Certain kind of spaciousness associated with wakefulness itself, with silence, and with being present. Again, if you find the mind wandering off and you're nowhere near your body anymore, but you're having lunch tomorrow someplace with somebody, or whatever, just noticing what's on your mind whenever it arises, and gently and lovingly just escorting your attention back to your belly or to the whole of the body sitting or to the breath at the nostrils or whatever is most vivid in the field of the body. And if the mind wanders again, just notice what's on your mind now, because it's always now. And then again, if you care to, reestablishing that connection. Once again with the breath, and just letting everything else be in the wings, coming and going. So we're not struggling with distraction, but we're just noticing what's happening, and as best we can, working the muscle of grounding ourselves in the body with full awareness. It's something we all are born capable of, to one degree or another, and we're just exercising this muscle. When you're ready, let's take a slow, deep, more intentional breath in. Really slow, deep, intentional breath in so that you're breathing down into your very pelvis and up into the very apices of the lungs behind the collarbones. And cradling the in-breath for a moment, holding it in, embracing it. And then when you're ready, just letting it wash out. And noticing that even as you do that, you can maintain a continuity in the awareness. The mind might say, oh, it's over. He didn't ring bells, or whatever the mind might say. And you can just realize that that's a thought that secreted itself from somewhere, and stay in the being present, even as you open your eyes if they were closed. And just sense not only the body as a whole sitting and breathing, but also, again, the fact that we're in this room together. And maybe taking a few moments to just feel in awareness the people on either side of you, the people behind you, if there are people in front of you, the people in front of you. And a sense somehow that we're all in here right now together. And therefore there's an element of, in some sense, common purpose, even if we don't know anybody else, but we're here for some non-random reason. You could have been anywhere else, but you chose to be here. You made an effort to be here at the end of the week. There's a certain kind of intentionality here that is palpable, and that's very, very beautiful, and it's not isolated in one of us. It's in some sense the beauty and the virtue of us getting together like this, and really, in some sense, sharing that passion that I was talking about in one way or another. Can you still hear me okay? Please shout out louder if my voice dips, because I don't want to be shouting at you, but I also want you to be able to hear. Can you hear me at the back of the room? No problems. Up there too? Hi, everybody. It's a little louder, huh? Maybe they can up the volume a little bit back there so that I don't have to. Beautiful. Thank you. Now, so in that brief kind of little experience of formal practice together, we did standing, we did moving, we did sitting. We played with bringing awareness to standing, moving, and sitting. If I'm not mistaken, you'll notice I never used the word mindfulness. We don't have to use the word mindfulness a lot to teach mindfulness, and it could be better if we don't, especially as the word gets more and more popular. There's a kind of, potential, problem that we'll start using the word in place of the actual lived experience of it, and turn it into a noun, when I really like to think of mindfulness as a verb. Okay? Why? Because it's all about relationality. It's all about the sort of ability to hold things in awareness and understand their relationship. So, all of us say, for instance, it's very peculiar to do that in the English language. I have a body, right? We all have bodies. But who's talking? It's a little bit of a problem. Who is the you that has the body? So what we're doing when we actually drop in on ourselves is beginning to experience something beyond the languaging of our experience to the actual direct experiencing of it, what we sometimes call first-person experience. And this actually has the potential to put us back in touch with our experience in ways that, I don't know if you've noticed this, but have you noticed that you can zone along on autopilot for actually years at a time? I mean, really. And the danger, of course, is that we might zone all the way along until our time on the planet is up, and then realize, oh my God, I wasn't paying attention. Maybe to what was important. Maybe I was paying attention or driven by what was going on in my head. For instance, what I thought was important, or what I felt I needed to do in order to get somewhere or be accomplished, or whatever that is, and in the process, miss a lot. Thoreau had a lot to say about that. And, so I don't know if you teach Thoreau in elementary school, but I'll bet you teach him in high school. If you don't, you should. He said, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what they had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I hadn't lived. That's the challenge here. Okay, and so here is, a tremendous opportunity with children in school to actually encourage them to experience what they're already experiencing and validate it as okay without having it have to be a certain way. See, mindfulness, my working definition of it is it's the awareness that arises by paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. Now, no one can do that, because if you start to pay attention to what's on your mind, you'll see that virtually everything is a judgment of one kind or another. We got ideas and opinions about virtually everything. I like this, I don't like that, on and on and on. So what that means, the non-judgmental, it doesn't mean, oh, let's pretend we don't have any judgments. No, let's be aware of how much judging we're doing. And then look at the awareness of the judging, and actually maybe that gives us a little bit of opening or a little bit of space where we don't even have to believe our own judgments. Because a lot of the time, they're binary, they're like, dislike, good, bad, up, down, and the world is not, for the most part, that way. It's gradations, everything from black to white, all sorts of gradations. And if we get caught in this binary dualism, we're actually, caught. We're really caught. This is an incredibly powerful thing to teach kids early on, that you're not your thoughts. People in the hospital, realize, sometimes like profound realization that I'm not my pain. Because a lot of people come to the stress reduction clinic in pain of one kind or another. And it could be emotional pain or it could be physical pain. But when you actually bring awareness to your pain, which who wants to do that? But if you do this very counterintuitive kind of thing and hold it in awareness, you actually realize that it's workable. That the awareness may not be suffering. That the suffering is in some sense added. That if you don't like the sensation, then you turn it into pain. It's actually a construct of the mind to a very large degree. And that if we know this, then we can be the knowing and not actually collapse into this and that. Now, when we relate to kids as if they are whole, we relate to our patients in the medical center seriously. I mean, as if they're geniuses. Another miraculous being has walked into the room. Well, if that's true for adults, it's got to be true for kids too. Are they suffering? Do you know any kids that are suffering out there? Okay. So it's not like, well, when they grow up, then they'll really experience suffering. Or anxiety. Or depression. Or a sense of not being seen or met or heard, maybe by anybody. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, so, and of course, what's the first thing you're going to think when you're in a situation like that? It's my fault. There's something wrong with me. Does that make any sense to you? And for them to actually be met by, say, a teacher, by anybody, by one human being, could be a parent, but let's say a teacher who actually is willing to encounter each child and actually make space for them as they are, not like, well, you're the problem one and I gotta straighten you out. That may be going on in your thoughts, but for now, can I just be with this child and maybe see that there's something going on that is behind or underneath the behaviors. And if I meet that, then maybe, the genius is lying right there. Maybe the beauty, maybe the miraculous quality of being is already in my classroom. And then that of course is very stress reducing for the teacher because it just requires a lot less work to be in harmony with the kids if you can be, and to be in your own spaciousness as opposed to having everything be a struggle. But that itself is a practice. It's actually working with our own impulses to want things to be a certain way and realize I don't even want that kid in my class or whatever it is. Or it's all problems. But the question is, can we actually relate to it underneath the problems? And find something here that is actually valid and valuable that could be acknowledged, that could be met. No words are necessary, actually, in some circumstances, but just that sense of seeing the other and making space, making room for that person with a degree of kindness, with a degree of acceptance, just as the way we treat our own experience. Because, in all Asian languages, I'm told, The word for mind and the word for heart is the same word. So when you're hearing the word mindfulness, or you're teaching mindfulness, if you don't hear or feel that there's the invitation in there for heartfulness, you're not actually understanding it correctly. Okay? It's what you might call an affectionate attention. It has interest intrinsically associated with it. It has curiosity intrinsically associated with it. And because of that, there's a certain kind of connectivity where you can be spacious even in the face of aversive things that are going on, like maybe, things not going the way you hoped they would go in a particular moment. And just, in some sense, stand your own ground as opposed to getting lost in trying to force them to be some other way. So mindfulness practice, in some sense, the core of it has to do with non-doing. Okay? And this is important, very important when we're developing curricula for different ages, that it's really important to actually keep in mind that mindfulness is really a sort of much more better described as a way of being than as a technique or a method or anything that you actually do. There are all sorts of methods, as I said, or exercises that you could do to cultivate it. But when you are inviting kids to develop this in this kind of a way, it's very important that this non-striving element be part of it, that we put out the welcome mat for whatever kids are feeling. If we're going to ask them, what are you feeling, then you can't give them that kind of ulterior motive kind of thing that you're supposed to feel this. If you're mindful, and you'll say, yeah, I'm happy, I'm having a cosmic experience, it's all wonderful. Do you know what I'm saying? The kid might say anything, including the truth. And we might not be ready for the truth, because a lot of the time we don't even know what they're coming from in the morning before school. So this is a huge thing, and we need to, in some sense, be ready for it. I mean, because when we create an environment where kids feel comfortable, then they'll actually be themselves and they'll be comfortable. And I think that what this leads to altogether is the opportunity for profound capacity for learning. And not just learning the lessons of interiority, the lessons of attention, the lessons of emotion regulation, the lessons of actually being embodied, the lessons of recognizing that you're not your thoughts, or some kind of cognitive perspective taking and so forth, but also the lessons of how beautiful the world is, the lessons of other people suffering too, of people having, experiences somewhat like yours or very different from yours, but that it's a plurality, and that too can be held in awareness with a degree of kindness and a degree of spaciousness. It's actually profoundly satisfying and not terrifying and doesn't produce anxiety, and in fact, in some ways, is kind of an antidote to anxiety, an antidote to depression. Is any of this making sense to you, or of a kind of like, okay. So, I'd like to read to you a passage that a woman that I met who took a stress reduction program, an MBSR program at the LDS Hospital, Latter-day Saints Hospital in Salt Lake City, a long time ago in the early 90s. Her name was Cherry Hamrick. And she took the MBSR program and decided, long before anyone had ever heard of mindfulness in the schools, that she took this program and it had a powerful effect on her. She said, I'm going to bring it into my class. And I said to her, because I met her at one point, I went out there and did a workshop, and I said to her, are you kidding? You're going to bring it into Mormon, 95% Mormon public school? I won't tell you exactly what I said to her, but it was along the lines of, don't do it. And like any good student, she didn't listen to me. Okay? Don't forget that one. The ones that aren't listening to you, they may be your best students. And what she did was she went to the Utah sort of public school manifesto, like when they created public schools in Utah, and there's a manifesto about it, and it said public schools need to address 4 dimensions of education, and there is the somatic, the emotional, the intuitive, and the cognitive. And she said, I don't see any emotional, I don't see any intuitive, I don't see any somatic, all I see is cognitive. But she took that as license. She didn't ask permission, she just took it as license to bring mindfulness into her classroom. And my wife and I wrote it up a little bit in our book on mindful parenting. But in researching it, one of her co-teachers, or one of her fellow teachers, wrote me a letter about it. I went out and visited her class and met her kids and so forth, and now they're like 30 years old, and we're doing a follow-up study on them, actually. It's a naturalistic study to see what the effects of that kind of training were 15 years later. So this is the teacher, 4th and 5th grade, writing. The attitude and climate in her classroom was speaking of Cherry, was very impressive, especially as I had not heretofore experienced anything like it. I became aware of certain vocabulary she used to describe things. She referred to what she was trying to attain as a functional classroom. I noticed a peaceful atmosphere in her classroom with the students cooperating and discussing their work together. Talking was encouraged, but only work-related talking and feeling talk was allowed. Only work-related and feeling talk was allowed. There was genuine interest and concern among the students and the teacher. They practiced talking about feelings and processing them on a daily basis. I noticed the students grow in their self-esteem and their regard for human life, as well as all life in general. The students seemed genuinely happier and more content in the classroom setting than I had ever observed or experienced myself. They expressed their love with appropriate touching, hugs in parentheses, and they knew how to resolve conflicts and solve problems and problem solve in a loving, caring fashion rather than a hostile or abusive fashion. Mrs. Hamrick also taught the students how to focus and how to get in touch with their own breathing and how to, she says, control their own lives with that technique. That would not be the phrase that I would use, by the way. I would try to take control out of all of the vocabulary, okay? Befriend is a good substitute, okay? Befriend our experience. They seem to be able to work better during the day after a few moments of meditative preparation in the morning. Okay? She had one child a day guide a sitting meditation, and they decided how long it was going to last. And they rang bells, and that the child, was in control of that and did it each morning. A different child each morning. We taught in an open classroom situation, and their ability to focus and not be distracted by all the noise in that environment is a tribute to her application of the application of her training and drive. I must say, she was able to integrate mindfulness into virtually every aspect of the curriculum, into the math, into social studies, whatever. She brought it to life in some way, because there's no duality between inner and outer. So if there's a subject, there's also an object, and it's like, but when they come together, it's like just love of learning. And part of school, it seems to me, is most kids, I think, come with love of learning. Even if they don't know anything about learning, still, they tend to be naturally curious. They tend to want to learn, but they're very different. They want to learn, in their own ways, or they have to be connected with and so forth. But the most important thing I would say about education is, let's not kill it, that love for learning, okay? Sometimes I think, and I've felt about my career, especially in university or in college, that, we get immunized to the various subjects we take in courses. Like, you take a little organic chemistry, immunized, for life. Never go there again. Take a little English grammar, immunized. Japanese history, forget about it. And so by the time we get a degree, if we're not careful, we can become narrower rather than actually more expansive and broader. And the point is that and people write about this all the time, for the next generation, the fact of the matter is, I read this someplace, that the most attractive jobs that are paying the highest salaries and that where they're recruiting the most aggressively for applicants. In 2010, 7 out of 10 of those jobs didn't exist in 2003. So we're actually training the next generation for a world that none of us has the slightest idea what it's going to be like. I'm not joking. I mean, all the educators agree that that is the case. And that our school system has actually devolved to a very large degree, I mean collectively across the country, that there's a certain way in which we are not really serving the country itself, because we're not serving the next generation and preparing them equally, you know, everybody, not just a few elite kids, but everybody for this new world that we're getting into. And when people look at it, I mean, the things that you need to prepare for a journey that you can't possibly predict what it's going to be like, those aren't actually more information usually. It's more a sense of confidence, it's more a sense of embodiment, it's more a sense of emotional intelligence, being able to decode your own feeling states and to decode the feeling states of others. And the classroom that this teacher was describing, the Cherry's classroom, that's what they were doing. But were they like forgetting about the math and the social studies and all the other subjects? No, they were not. They were bringing them to life, and the kids were actually more engaged in them because they had created this kind of environment. But the environment was not a coercive one. She started slowly. She developed this over time. They practiced sitting meditation, lying down, walking meditation, all of this. And she actually, because this was 15 years ago, she actually held in-services for the parents so that they would, because they were going home and saying to the mother when she got upset about how they were loading the dishwasher, I heard the story like this, you know, sort of, why is your mind getting so jumpy? You don't need to be jumpy like that. Just stay with your breath. And the mother was, what the hell is these kids learning in school? Or one other thing, another parent overheard, because this spread through the school. It started out in the 4th and 5th grade, but then all the other teachers wanted to, you know, bring it into the school as well. So it actually spread in the course of 6 years through the entire school. And one story that came back to me was like somebody's sister was being teased by somebody else, and her brother said to her, just because that person's mind is jumping all over the place, it doesn't mean your mind has to jump all over the place. And they would support each other in this kind of way. Sometimes they'd even meditate together. This is in Mormon, Utah. And actually the 6th grade teacher was a Mormon bishop. And he was teaching mindfulness as well. This is universal. There's nothing about paying attention that is the property of any particular view or culture or tradition or religion or anything like that. It's universal. It's got nothing to do with any of that stuff. I don't even use the word spirituality because, you know, as soon as you tread in that way, you're going to create the same kind of dualism. Some people love it, and other people are going to think you're sort of trying to turn my child into a Buddhist or whatever. This has nothing to do with Buddhism. I think it's important to say these things because, you know, sooner or later someone brings up that kind of thing, and we have to have a vocabulary that's really robust enough, and also data, research, evidence that this is valuable for children. And I can tell you that there's a huge amount of brain research that's pointing to the value of these kinds of practices. These kinds of practices in a completely secular environment. Cliff Sarin from the MIND program at UC Davis is here, and a number of other neuroscientists as well. And I won't go into it in any detail, but for instance, adults who are trained in MBSR show major changes in the brain in 8 weeks of training in terms of activity levels in particular regions, and also actually structural changes. Because it turns out, correct me if I'm wrong, Cliff, but that the brain is in some sense the organ of experience. And we're just discovering, by the way, maybe 15 years ago, that it's a phenomenon called neuroplasticity, that probably when all of the older people in this room, what I learned when I was at MIT and, molecular biology, was that that at a certain point, neurons only died. From about the age of 2, your neurons in the central nervous system just started to die. Of course, you have 200 billion of them, so, you got a lot to go on, even if you lose, a neuron here, a neuron there. But over time, more and more neurons die. And it was like axiomatic. It was like dogma. No new neurons, functional neurons, are laid down in the central nervous system in the brain. It turns out not to be true. Very interesting history about it, too, because there were some young graduate students that actually showed evidence, strong evidence, published in the best science journals, that actually there were new neurons being laid down, and functional neurons in the brain, and but the dogma was so strong that those people were virtually drummed out of the field. So when we talk about education, they were highly educated people, and they wound up driving buses or something, because, when you go against the dogma of the day, you have to pay a certain kind of price. On the other hand, what are we training our children for if not to go against the dogma of the day? Because the dogma of the day is not going to be what we need for tomorrow. There's a certain consensus reality that is continually changing and growing, and we need our young people to be fully equipped to deal with what Zorba the Greek called the full catastrophe of the human condition, especially since we are such a precocious species, and we can create things like iPhones and iPads that, after a while we get so attached to them, we can hardly be in relationship to ourselves because I might be getting a more interesting email or text. And I mean, there are people probably in this audience who have never actually experienced the analog world, because if you were born after a certain time, it's all, the digital stuff is so available. So that just compounds the challenge of, there are more distractions now than ever before. How are we going to actually be in relationship to these things in ways that we can actually teach the children to connect with themselves, not 24/7 connectivity everywhere else, but not to yourself? Because there's a certain kind of emptiness to that. There's a certain kind of relentless, addictive, seductive quality to that actually breeds suffering. And you can probably feel it. We're all nodding our heads. Meanwhile, we're all addicted. There was even a nice little piece in the New York Times Magazine that was labeled Between the Tweets. It was a married couple together in bed, and each one had an iPhone looking over the other's shoulder, tweeting about something, in an embrace, in the bed. Between the tweets. Just a new dimension of relationality. I'm sure you don't have a problem with that, but now there is a sense that I have, and I meet a fair number of teachers. Cherry and I actually did a program on mindfulness in the classroom in 1995 for 200 teachers, back when almost nobody had heard of it. And I really tried to get Bill Moyers to film in her classroom, and for one reason or another, it didn't work out. And then tragically, Cherry died in 2006 of an asthma attack followed by a heart attack, and she was just gone. And so I'd like to just honor the fact that this incredibly creative person, against all odds, just saw the potential here and brought it into her classroom, and I think touched the hearts of many, many people, certainly touched my heart. But I want to talk also about mindful schools and all the other places in the country that are doing this, because it's not just mindful schools. But mindful schools, and you probably saw the display out there, is touching thousands and thousands of kids and hundreds of teachers and moving into more and more school systems. And this is really a new phase of this unfolding of mindfulness in mainstream society. And then it's happening in Harlem and in New York City, in general, and in South Burlington, Vermont, and in all sorts of other places. If you haven't seen it, you can Google some fellows named Ali and Atman Smith, who are teaching in the inner city of Baltimore, where they grew up, and they're teaching mindful yoga, and it's all on the ABC Nightly News with Brian Williams. If you Google that, you'll see it's like just unbelievable what they're doing in the neighborhood that they grew up in, that really is a bit like Desolation Row, and they are there, and they are working with the schools, and they are working with the kids after school, and they're just bringing, so many people are bringing mindfulness into the mainstream of their work in schools in one way or another, out of their own creativity, out of their own passion, and out of their own, in some sense, desperation. Because it's like, if the system is not working, we have to avail ourselves of something that might actually right the ship, so to speak. And why not start at the absolute core, which is attention and awareness, what I like to think of as the final common pathway of what makes us human. So let me just consult my notes for a moment. Yeah, there's one thing that I do want to point out to you, because there's a paper that is going to soon be published, the title of which is Integrating Mindfulness Training into K-12 Education. And there are 14 authors on this paper from 8 different universities and medical schools, including Harvard and Johns Hopkins and the University of Wisconsin. And the first author of that paper actually gave me permission to give you his email if you want to get an in-press copy of this paper, which actually maps out in general terms all of the science behind mindfulness, including the brain science, and why it might be important to bring this into K-12 education. So I won't belabor the point, but it talks about major programs out there for teachers and major programs out there for students, and Mindful Schools is featured as one of those programs.
Woohoo!
The email, if you want a copy of this paper pre-publication, it's going to be published in a journal called Mindfulness. Just the fact that there is a journal called Mindfulness now is in itself remarkable. And his email, his name is Jon Michael John. I'm going to spell it for you. And the email is this: JOHNMEIKLEJOHN @Comcast.net. I thought you'd want it one more time. JOHNMEIKLEJOHN @Comcast.net. Got it? No. Well, this is an interesting educational experience. Let me repeat it again.
Michael isn't how you think it should.
Michael is not the way it's usually spelled, okay? So don't pay any attention to how it sounds, just listen to what I say, in this instance at least, J.John, the name John, J-O-H-N, M-E-I-K-L-E, and then the name John again, @Comcast.net, okay? Now, the other thing I want to say is that this is part of a much larger movement. 2 days ago, Charlie Halpern, sitting in the audience from the Berkeley Law School, we had a dialogue at the law school on mindfulness in the law. Okay, I don't know if you have heard of Google. Has anybody heard of Google? Well, one of the early engineers at Google Meng Chedtang is publishing a book next month called, get this, Search Inside Yourself. What's Google do? Search. So he's developed a program, mindfulness-based program, called Search Inside Yourself. They also have MBSR at Google. They've had it for years. Okay, so this is moving into the mainstream. Next week there's a program in Silicon Valley called Wisdom 2.0, where all the people from Twitter and Facebook and Google and eBay and all those people who are bringing you, and Apple are bringing you all of this stuff that could be terminally distracting, but also, hey, can't live with it, can't live without it. I mean, it's really, it's just what it is. It's amazing. But we need to find ways to be mindful. I saw in one of the curricula that I was examining, mindful texting. Check it out. Mindful emailing. I know at least one recommendation for mindful emailing. You might want to write this down. Read it again before you press send. And then to just close, this is really a worldwide phenomenon. MBSR has spread around the world, so has its relatives, MBCT and MBCRP and MBRP and MB je ne sais quoi, and just on and on and on, with a very, very powerful and spreading research base. If you plot the number of papers in the scientific and medical literature as a function of time, starting back in the 1980, and it just zones along like this, and then at a certain point in the mid to late 90s, it just starts to go higher and higher, and now it's going virtually straight up. It's going exponential. The funding at NIH and other institutions for funding is actually following that curve. Okay? This would have been considered inconceivable 30 years ago, that meditative practices would move into the mainstream of scientific dialogue and conversation, and it's already happened, and the funding is following. It's very easy to exaggerate out of our enthusiasm what this all means, especially the neuroscientific results. And as a scientist, I really want to stress that this stuff would be valuable even if there was no neuroscientific evidence for it. Okay? So we need to be careful in our discourse that while it's really important to understand or to utilize as much of the neuroscience to explain why this would be valuable for the growing brain, for instance, and the the developing neocortex, and for things like working memory and executive functioning and so forth. And you'll read a lot out there. It's very, very important to approach that with a certain kind of caution, especially if you're not a neuroscientist, because the neuroscientists know how to actually give caveats and say, well, that's kind of true, but the details are much more complicated. And so we're very, very complicated. And this is a growing movement that has so much virtue that it's really important, I think, to stay grounded in the actual practices and in the value that comes from the social emotional learning, from the developing of strategies and practices that kids can take home and work with day in, day out, year in, year out, and over time actually develop into what I like to call full-fledged planetary adults. Emotionally intelligent, grounded in the body, in touch with others, compassionate, caring. All of these things come out of the practice, and it's very, very important to stay grounded in some sense in what you know, and of course that means ultimately it's very hard to teach this stuff in any kind of authentic way unless you're practicing yourself. And that's, in some sense, the bottom line. Now, that doesn't mean, oh my God, now more work for me. I can't teach the mindfulness curriculum because it means I have to sort of go away and sit on the mountaintop or in a cave for 30 years or something like that. No, this stuff is intuitively available, but please know that it's not as simple as what it's sometimes cracked up to be. It can't very easily be scripted. While more and more curricula are coming out, it's very important that the people who are putting out these curricula, that you know these people have years and years and sometimes decades of meditation training under their belts. That's true for mindful schools. That's true for, many, many programs here. And so the learning curve can be steep. It doesn't have to be like 5 years or 2 years even, but that you really understand that it's very hard to teach someone else to pay attention and to rest in awareness and to cultivate kindness if you yourself in some way are, just doing it as a kind of abstract curriculum as opposed to a lived experience. And the kids, of course, they're smart. They'll figure it out immediately. So there has to be a kind of confluence, a kind of congruence between who you are and what you're teaching. And when they figure that out, which takes them about a nanosecond, then that's where the love is. That's where, the beauty is. That's where the learning sort of all of a sudden really ignites. And, again, even subjects that might be difficult, that passion can carry the day, and really important to stay with. So the only other thing I want to mention in terms of the national scene is that a congressman who you may not have heard of, but probably will soon, named Tim Ryan from the 17th Congressional District in Ohio, Youngstown and so forth, who's promoting mindfulness in the schools in Youngstown, which is, in the Rust Belt and just in a very, very, very hard time in this economic climate that we're in. He is coming out with a book next month as well called A Mindful Nation. Okay? In which he goes around and he visits. He visited the mind-body awareness people. A shout out to Vinny and Chris and to all sorts of places around the country looking at mindfulness in schools, in education, mindfulness in the military, mindfulness in medicine, and he sits on the House Appropriations Committee on all those subcommittees: education, healthcare, and military. Defense. So this is the first congressperson in American history to actually advocate for and write a book and put his own political career on the line around paying attention. It's a kind of good idea, isn't it? I mean, like maybe somebody should be paying attention, especially if the children that we're educating now, when they get big, maybe they might have a different way of waging peace rather than war. Maybe let's figure out what are the 3 best reasons to go to war when none of them are actually true. What about a little awareness at that moment, it's not the military that's at fault. It's not the military. The military does it's like the immune system, for God's sake, it does what it's supposed to do. But in fact, the military is rampant with people who are practicing mindfulness for all sorts of very interesting reasons that have much more to do with peace than to do with aggression and war. But the real place that needs mindfulness, I'm sorry to say, isn't even in the schools. It's in the Congress. And while they often say, every time there's an election that their healthcare system, their healthcare package is better than anybody else's and everybody should have what they have, they don't have MBSR. So they could learn it in a way that has nothing to do with Democrat, Republican, right, left, or whatever. Just practice and see what that does to all of this sort of accretion around, and I'll finish with this, like the personal pronouns. Have you noticed how easy it is to kind of contract around the personal pronouns? If you've forgotten what they are and you need, of course, probably many of you teach English and grammar and so forth. So the personal pronouns are I, me, and mine, okay, the singular personal pronouns. Okay, and so we notice how much of the time we actually make a big story about me and my this and my that, and we take things personally that very often are not personal. If we could learn actually not to take personally things that aren't personal, boy, our stress would be so much more reduced immediately, So what does that take? It only takes one thing: awareness. We see how easily we get caught by the future, by the past, by my success, by my failure, by my health, by my this, by my that. And it's all fine, except that there's something missing, and that's that whoever is talking is tiny compared to the enormity of who we actually are. Tiny. And we just don't have a vocabulary yet for talking about these things. But, if you think about, just what's encased in your head for a moment, that they're the brain. And Dan Siegel is in the audience who, can tell you everything you want to know about the brain. Extraordinary. As I understand it, there are, upwards of 200 billion neurons in the brain, and then there are 200 billion other cells that no one knows what they're doing, called glia, also in there. No one knows really what they're doing. And this is the most complex organization of matter in the known universe, right inside your little old head. Okay? So when we get that despondent, when we think, oh, maybe there's something wrong with me, there's a little, sort of not, this, not too that, not enough this, not too much that, maybe it would be wise to actually remember that we have no idea who we really are. And all of our propaganda about it, and the personal pronouns and the attachment to them and so forth, it's good to be aware of it, because then we can navigate in a much bigger space. Much, much bigger space. And if you learn this when you're young, can you imagine the amount of, here's a technical psychological term for you. Can you imagine the amount of surus that you would actually avoid? That is Yiddish for trouble or difficulties. If you just simply learned how to get out of your own way. Okay? Now, if we bring awareness to how we conduct ourselves during the day, a lot of time we're creating the stress ourselves. It's not the stress, it's how we respond to it that makes all the difference. And we have a lot of latitude in that regard. So I'd like to thank you for your attention. We could actually go on and go deeper in a lot of different ways, but I would prefer to actually bring it to a close at this point in time, and then open it for questions so that we could have something of a dialogue, okay? Because it's it'd be much richer, I think, if we hear from you, and particularly the people who are on the front lines every day in the schools, and the principals and the teachers and so forth. Again, a deep bow to you for what you're doing, and hopefully Mindful Schools and a lot of other organizations and the Congress eventually will actually support what you're doing, because the entire life and health of the society and the nation actually depend on it. That's all. Thank you. So, as I understand it, there are microphones in the aisles, and if anybody would care to make a comment or ask a question, we've got maybe 20 minutes or so to do that. I'm not saying I'll be able to answer any of the questions, but we'll see. Yeah, don't be shy. You can be first. Then you get the stress over with.
I'll do that. Can you hear me?
Yeah. And do you want to introduce yourself? You don't have to, but...
yeah, my name is Leah Pinelli, and I'm a teacher at a public school in San Francisco.
All right.
And my question is, I'm actually extremely concerned about the lack of mental health services in our public schools. For me, as an educator, my biggest challenge is not necessarily... It's with kids not having the support they need in terms of mental health. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to, and also the kind of pressure on teachers to be both social workers or therapists and teachers, which I would love to do, but I actually don't have the capacity to do both. So I'm wondering how you see maybe mindfulness as maybe, do you see it as playing some kind of role in terms of, I think there's probably a clear link, but I'm just wondering if you could speak to that in terms of mindfulness and actually supporting kids with mental health.
Yeah, and stay there so that we can have a dialogue about it. Well, first of all, I'm really glad you asked that question. And I've read statistics that maybe 1 in 5 kids in elementary school has, a mental health diagnosis of some kind. And that in itself, we just pause for a moment and recognize the degree of suffering that's involved in that. And, mental health is like a big label. Who knows what the family situation is, what the sort of early childhood of that child was like. So you're getting people coming into your classroom who may not really be ready to function at the level that you need them to function at to just do your job as a teacher. And you're not necessarily, or you or others are not going to necessarily be trained as either a social worker or a child psychiatrist or therapist. So this is a huge problem, and I, of course, don't have any answer to it. I don't think that, that bringing mindfulness in the classroom really means that we're asking you to become a therapist by any stretch of the imagination, or a social worker, but to actually recognize who's in your classroom already. And if you don't have any resources for helping those children in a particular way, it's amazing how much learning how to drop into stillness and learning how to recognize your own anxious thoughts or depressive thoughts or fearful thoughts or whatever, and then cultivate a wiser, if you will, or a kindlier relationship with them can actually be transformative. And we're talking about kids who are relatively young. So when you start relatively young, when their brains are still in formation and so forth, even if they've been traumatized, and a lot of the children in school have been frankly traumatized, and that has its own effects on the central nervous system. There's a lot of evidence that the more you actually cultivate these muscles of attention and emotion regulation and body awareness and so forth, the more you actually repair some of that damage and move towards greater health. Now, that doesn't mean that you are in the stress reduction mental health business by any stretch of the imagination, but it means that if you have almost nothing but you're giving that to the child, that's better than nothing. That's what I would say. On the other hand, you do have to be prepared if you're allowing kids or inviting kids to actually be in touch with themselves, that they may actually disclose things that you're not prepared to hear or that you need to act on. And in that case, you need the support of the school system, just the same way the school system supports children who have different learning styles, and it's mandated that those learning styles get met and those kids get worked with. At least it is in Massachusetts. I don't know if it is in California. But in the same way, we need to restructure things to whatever degree is possible. I'm not sort of giving that as a pie in the sky response, but merely the more support you can get from your school system around the edges of that kind of thing, so that if somebody does kind of go into a situation where they're disclosing things that you need to act on, that you have some kind of backup and follow-up to do that. I think that will be in the far minority, but you do have to be prepared for it. More than that, I really can't say, but I certainly, again, I can feel that, from what you said, the intrinsic pain in being asked to do so many different jobs that really aren't your job, and then having it be so challenging to really do your job. And I think that you need to take care of yourself. One of the virtues of this kind of thing, again, without turning it into some kind of romantic idealization, which I hope nobody does with mindfulness, it's not the answer to all life's problems. And, and when you bring mindfulness to your life, you're going to be the same old person you always were, only you'll be more aware of it. So that might actually be problematic in the short run, but in the long run, then if you don't identify with that as being who you really are, then you've got an awful lot of room to grow. And actually, the inner organs, the entire body responds in this kind of a way. So it's a way of being more stress resilient and healthier as well. I'm talking just for the teachers, never mind for the kids. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we'll go to this side.
Hi, I'm not sure if this is a question as so much as a comment. And I feel like I'm an educator on the front lines as a parent.
Yes.
And having learned NBSR myself when my children were very young, it's just a natural part of the vocabulary in our home. And now that my kids are in an elementary school, I feel like one of the challenges that I have in continuing to teach or just to be this way in our natural function is the competition that they're learning in school. And this hyper-achievement focused environment that they're in doesn't allow necessarily the space for them to operate this way in school. And, you know, in our school, we don't have any kind of awareness of this at all. And so their struggles sometimes come home. We reorient them, if you will, with this type of approach. And then they go back and they kind of assert who they are. Hopefully, you know, giving them that foundation.
Right.
But it's a struggle to continue to hold on to that. That's what they're showing me, that it's a difficulty that they are challenged with. And, you know, I struggle with that as their parent to help them to be successful in that environment, but yet hold on to this core value. And it's a challenge, and I don't know, again, if that's a question or...
Well, I appreciate your letting me off the hook by saying it might not be a question. But I want to really first acknowledge that I didn't mention anything really about parents. So it's not just about the teachers. I mean, how many of you here are parents? Look around. Okay, so yeah, everything that's been said is just as true for us as parents as it is for the teachers. I mean, and so the question is, again, how to be in wise relationship with these growing beings who are going out there and experiencing the world in ways that you don't have all that much of a say in, never mind control over, and so how does the home affect what's going on in school, and how much tension is there between the two? And this becomes the practice itself, to sort of stay grounded in your own experience and your own sense of what they most need, and then be that for them as best you can, so that the practice isn't like a bunch of rules or instructions, but it's a way of being that they can feel from you. And to just say that this is what I started out by saying, that mindfulness is how we live our lives from moment to moment. So there is no script, and there's no one right way that Jon Kabat-Zinn will just give it to you and then whoopee, you know, I was like, okay, we'll all just follow what he says. I don't have the slightest idea how you would deal with that in this particular school situation. But you may have many ideas about it. Many of them may turn out to crash and burn. But if you stay in the relationship and you stay with the process, and you don't, again, make it into a bad and good, okay? So that like school then becomes like bad, and then the way we do it in the family, good. Then you may find that the kids have their own natural way of understanding what is healthy and what's not, and you nurture that over time. And what seems like very often challenges that you'll never recover from, actually you recover from. Yeah, so thank you for the comment, and just again, a deep bow to all of the parents out there, many of whom are also working in the classroom as teachers, because this is, I would say, again, to maybe just a cautionary note with all the enthusiasm around mindfulness, it's only the hardest work in the world, folks. I mean, and I'm not joking. I mean, for a human being to be present is tough. I mean, it requires actually aware of, people say, well, what do you get out of mindfulness? Well, the first thing you get out of mindfulness when you start practicing is realizing how mindless you are. And again, if you take that personally, then you're in big trouble, and you say, this mindfulness stuff doesn't work, I'm never going to get anywhere with it, I'm hopeless. But the fact of the matter is, it's a process, it's a way of being, and the more you work with it, and there's no one right way to do that, then your kids become your teachers. As a teacher, isn't that the case, that your kids wind up teaching you a lot? I mean, I learn more from my students than they ever learned from me. I mean, it is a dance of relationality, and the awareness actually gives us new dimensions of creativity and imagination for working with it. And then, in some sense, you're on your own, except that if you look around, you're not on your own. We're all dealing with this kind of thing. Everybody's dealing with it. And slowly, we're actually shifting the bell curve of the culture towards a culture that actually honors more integration in one's life, integration in one's nervous system, integration in one's body, integration in one's relationships. And is it difficult to grow into adulthood? You betcha it is. And we have to find ways to ride the waves of the up and the down that have integrity and that maintain a certain kind of calmness and potentially equanimity and actually a sense of profound satisfaction. I mean, parenting is not a life sentence in prison. I mean, it's really one of the most beautiful experiences of our humanity. But sometimes it can feel like a life sentence, and that's when we need each other's support, as well as kind of just remembering, to remind yourself and to drop back in. And, I emphasize knowing, awareness is knowing. I should have emphasized equally that awareness is also not knowing how little we know, and being able to be that knowing of not knowing. And there is where the creativity and the imagination come in. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening. So I'm going to do my best to, first of all, I'm Rob Williams. I'm chair of counseling at San Francisco State. I'm here with the principal from East Oakland Elementary School. So I'm here with someone who's on the front lines for sure. And I want to be careful not to reinforce the pre-existing negative stereotype about violence in Oakland and African Americans. So I want to put that out as a caveat that I don't want that to happen, but the fact of the matter is that mindfulness definitely creates opportunities for peace from within and then emanates outward. And these kids can go to their homes and have peace when their mom was upset about dishes, as you said earlier. But then there's the trek between school and home, home back to school, where there is violence for some people and chaos and disturbance. And how do we bring these children back to center when the violence happens right outside their school? When we're saying to them, focus on the 3 R's and stay balanced, but ignore that dead body out there you have to walk past, or ignore the drug dealers, or your friends and family are involved in that stuff. How do we work these two together? I see them as I see this as a part of the solution, but I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Oh, that's very beautiful. Thank you. Stay there in case we want to go back and forth about this. And I don't know if we will, but first of all, thank you for how beautifully you articulated that. Well, I was trying to point to this in my talk, in the sense that if we're going to open up to mindfulness, then we're basically opening up to everything. Awareness doesn't segregate. Okay, this we can be aware of, but this we can't pay attention to. So in a sense, it's an invitation to actually have conversations about what people may not be having conversations about, and bring awareness to, hey, what is it like for you to walk home from school? I mean, I remember what it was like to be terrified to walk home from school, because if I walked certain ways, I was sure to get beat up. And if I walked other ways, the probability was lower. Not that much lower. And, but that was never a conversation with anybody else. I mean, I had to figure out for myself how to do that. But supposing that became part of the curriculum, is here we are in this location, and what is this location? I mean, maybe couldn't that be part of like the conversation, and how do you feel about these kinds of things? And actually, are there ways that we might, organize ourselves inwardly as well as outwardly to deal with some of the things that we're seeing from moment to moment, and so that the kids aren't, because they're experiencing it anyway, but they don't have those outlets for actually sharing them in ways that reinforce the peacefulness, reinforce the clarity, reinforce the sense that also of non-isolation, that you're not alone, that you're not in this all by yourself. So that would mean in some sense that the curriculum would be local, in the sense that if that was an issue in the school, that it would actually become part of the curriculum of how you dealt with your experience. But then, of course, you have to be willing to hear what's going on, and then how are you going to actually deal with it as a teacher if you don't have any experience of that yourself. So it brings up very big questions, but I do feel that there's no point in turning away from it all and hiding from those kinds of issues, but instead put out the welcome mat. That's what mindfulness is about, turning towards what is most aversive rather than turning away, and then finding ways to be in wiser and more compassionate relationship to it. And I'll just put in a plug again, that we don't need to know how to do this. All we have to do is trust that our imagination and our creativity can actually be exercised when we create conditions for paying attention in this way, with heartfulness.
Well, thank you. I won't dialogue any further.
Well, it could be a long conversation, but thank you for at least standing there, because thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to...
You can tip that up, and then you don't have to... Yeah, just tilt it up like that.
My name is Edward, and I'm a resident at the San Francisco Zen Center. And
Great.
I heard that you had done some Zen practice in your life, and I was just curious if you had any sort of recommendations for a young Zen student about, like, maybe somebody who's interested in not necessarily the school setting, but sort of a more broad, like you said, planetary adult or global citizen or something of that nature. Maybe like a recommendation of, I don't know, maybe just speak to that a bit.
Well, my immediate response would be, keep practicing, and it will come to you. But I don't mean that in any kind of facile way. But when you keep asking yourself, and I